The steamboat's whistle cut through the morning fog like a knife through silk, echoing across the muddy waters of the Mississippi. Clara Bennett pressed her palm against the cool glass of the cabin window, watching the shoreline blur past in. Streaks of green and brown. Her other hand rested protectively over the gentle swell beneath her dark wool traveling dress, a secret she carried like a stone in her chest. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 months. That's how long it had been since she'd received the letter that changed everything. The envelope had arrived at the boarding house in Boston, thick cream paper that spoke of prosperity and hope. Inside, written in careful script, were the words that had lifted her from despair, seeking a God-fearing woman of good character for marriage and companionship in the growing town of Silver Creek, Montana. Must be of sound moral standing and willing to embrace frontier life. The letter was signed by Nathaniel Garrett, and it had come with a daguerreotype of a stern-faced man with kind eyes and a small deposit for travel expenses. Clara had stared at that photograph for hours, memorizing every line of his face, imagining the life they might build together in the wilderness. She had written back immediately, her pen trembling as she crafted the perfect response. She told him of her skills in cooking and sewing, her experience managing a household, her deep faith and desire for a simple, honest life. What she didn't tell him was about the night 6 months ago, when her world had crumbled, when the man she thought she would marry had vanished like smoke, leaving her with nothing but shame and a growing reminder of her foolishness. The boarding house matron, Mrs. Winters, had been the one to suggest the mail-order arrangement. Out west, they're not so particular about a woman's past, she had whispered conspiratorially. A man needs a wife to survive those harsh winters, and they don't ask too many questions about where you've been, only where you're going. Clara had clung to those words like a drowning woman clings to driftwood. She had carefully tailored her correspondence to present herself as a widow, recently bereaved and seeking a fresh start. The lie had burned in her throat as she wrote it, but desperation had a way of making liars of honest people. Now, as the steamboat churned steadily westward, carrying her toward an uncertain future, Clara wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. The child within her had begun to show despite her best efforts to conceal it with tight corsets and loose-fitting dresses. Soon there would be no hiding the truth, and she could only pray that Nathaniel Garrett was the understanding man his letters suggested. The boat lurched suddenly, and Clara gripped the window frame to steady herself. Outside, the landscape was changing, becoming wilder and more untamed with each passing mile. Gone were the neat farms and orderly towns of the east, replaced by endless stretches of prairie grass and scattered homesteads that looked impossibly small against the vast sky. A knock at her cabin door made her jump. "Ma'am, we'll be docking in St. Louis within the hour," called the steward. Clara's heart raced. St. Louis was where she would board the overland stage that would take her the final 700 miles to Silver Creek, the last leg of her journey to a new life. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She moved to her small trunk and carefully removed the one good dress she owned, a deep blue silk that had belonged to her mother. She had saved it for her wedding day, back when she believed such a day would come with love and joy instead of necessity and deception. The fabric whispered against her fingers as she laid it out on the narrow bunk, and for a moment she allowed herself to remember her mother's gentle hands braiding her hair, her soft voice singing lullabies. Clara's mother had died when she was 16, leaving her alone in the world with nothing but her reputation and her needlework skills to sustain her. She had found work as a seamstress in Boston, living quietly in the boarding house, keeping to herself and saving every penny she could. She had thought herself safe from the world's cruelties, but safety was an illusion that could be shattered by a charming smile and false promises. The man's name had been William Harrington, and he had swept into her life like a summer storm. He was a traveling salesman with silver-streaked hair and golden words, and he had courted her with the persistence of a man who knew exactly what lonely women wanted to hear. He spoke of marriage, of taking her away from the cramped boarding house to a little cottage where they would raise a family together. She had believed every word. When she discovered she was carrying his child, Clara had run to him with tears of joy, expecting to be embraced and celebrated. Instead, she found his room at the hotel empty, his belongings gone, and the clerk's sympathetic shake of the head. William Harrington had vanished as suddenly as he had appeared, leaving behind only a broken heart and a growing scandal. The shame had been overwhelming. Mrs. Winters had been kind enough not to turn her out immediately, but Clara knew her time was limited. Unmarried pregnant women were not tolerated in respectable boarding houses, and the streets of Boston were no place for a woman in her condition. That's when the idea of the frontier had taken root. Out there, in the wild spaces where civilization was still taking shape, perhaps there was room for second chances. Perhaps there was a man who would value companionship and partnership over perfection and purity. The steamboat's whistle sounded again, longer this time, signaling their approach to the docks. Clara dressed carefully, arranging her shawl to disguise her condition as much as possible. She pinned her auburn hair in a severe bun and checked her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. She looked pale but respectable, tired but determined. As the boat eased into the dock with a great churning of water and shouting of men, Clara gathered her few possessions and made her way to the deck. The smell of the river hit her first muddy and alive, followed by the cacophony of a bustling port city. St. Louis spread out before her like a promise and a threat, its brick buildings and smoking chimneys reaching toward a sky the color of pewter. The stage depot was a 15-minute walk from the docks, and Clara navigated the crowded streets with careful steps, one hand clutching her carpet bag in the other, maintaining her protective position over her growing belly. St. Louis was louder and rougher than Boston, full of men in frontier clothes and women with hard eyes and harder lives. At the depot, she purchased passage to Silver Creek with the last of her traveling money, keeping only enough for a modest meal. The clerk, a grizzled man with tobacco-stained teeth, looked her up and down with the calculating gaze of someone who had seen every type of traveler pass through his doors. "Silver Creek, eh? You got folks there?" he asked, stamping her ticket with unnecessary force. "My intended," Clara replied, lifting her chin with what she hoped looked like confidence. The man nodded and handed her the ticket. "Stage leaves at dawn. You'll want to get yourself some rest and a good meal. It's a hard ride, and the road can be unforgiving to those who ain't prepared for it." Clara spent the night in a small hotel near the depot, lying awake on the lumpy mattress and staring at the water-stained ceiling. Tomorrow she would begin the final phase of her journey, the one that would take her into the unknown wilderness where Nathaniel Garrett waited. She tried to picture their meeting, rehearsing the words she would use to explain her condition, the careful half-truths she would tell to make her situation sound more palatable. Sleep finally came in the small hours before dawn, filled with dreams of endless prairie grass and a faceless man who might or might not have room in his heart for a woman with secrets and a child that wasn't his. The stage was a weathered coach pulled by 6 sturdy horses, and Clara found herself squeezed between a traveling preacher and a woman who claimed to be going west to start a millinery shop. The preacher, Brother Samuel, was a thin man with intense eyes who spoke frequently about divine providence and the Lord's plan for all souls. The milliner, Miss Abigail Howard, was practical and sharp-tongued, with opinions about everything from women's suffrage to the proper way to treat horse harness. As the stage rolled out of St. Louis in the gray dawn light, Clara watched the last vestiges of civilization fall away behind them. The road stretched ahead like a ribbon through an ocean of grass, and she felt simultaneously terrified and exhilarated by the vastness of it all. "First time west?" Miss Howard asked, noting Clara's wide-eyed expression. "Yes," Clara admitted. "I'm traveling to meet my intended." "Mail order arrangement?" the woman asked bluntly. When Clara nodded, she laughed, but not unkindly. "Honey, half the women out here came the same way. Nothing to be ashamed of. Sometimes a practical arrangement works out better than all that romantic nonsense the novels go on about." Brother Samuel leaned forward, his eyes lighting up with evangelical fervor. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, sister. Perhaps He is guiding you toward your rightful destiny." Clara managed a weak smile and turned her attention back to the window. The landscape was changing hour by hour, becoming flatter and more desolate. Occasionally they would pass a lonely farmstead or a cluster of buildings that might generously be called a town, but mostly there was just grass and sky and the endless rhythm of the horses' hooves. They stopped frequently to change horses and rest the passengers, and at each stop, Clara felt the weight of curious stares from other travelers and station workers. She kept her shawl pulled tight and her head down, painfully aware that her condition was becoming more difficult to disguise with each passing day. On the second day of travel, they encountered their first real taste of frontier danger. The stage was climbing a low hill when one of the lead horses stumbled and went down, tangling in the harness and causing the whole team to rear and plunge in panic. The driver fought to control them while the guard jumped down to help, shouting instructions and curses in equal measure. Clara was thrown against Miss Howard as the stage lurched and tilted dangerously. For a terrifying moment, she thought they might overturn, but the driver's skill and the guard's quick action kept them upright. The injured horse had to be cut free from the traces and left behind, and they continued with 5 horses instead of 6, making slower progress over the increasingly rough terrain. "Welcome to the frontier," Miss Howard said dryly, adjusting her disheveled hat. "Out here, every day is an adventure, whether you want one or not." That night they stopped at a way station that was little more than a log cabin with a lean-to stable. The accommodations were rough, with all the passengers sharing a single room divided by hanging blankets. Clara lay on her narrow cot, listening to Brother Samuel's snores and Miss Howard's occasional mutterings in her sleep, and wondered what Nathaniel Garrett would think of a woman who arrived dusty, tired, and obviously pregnant. The final day of travel dawned clear and cold, with a sharp wind that cut through even the heaviest clothing. Clara's back ached from the constant jolting of the stage, and her feet were swollen from sitting cramped in the small space for so many hours. But as the sun climbed higher, she began to see signs of their destination, more frequent farmsteads, better maintained roads, and finally, in the distance, the cluster of buildings that marked Silver Creek. The town was larger than she had expected, with a proper main street lined with businesses and several side streets, branching off into residential areas. There was a church with a white steeple, a schoolhouse, a general store, and what appeared to be a small hotel. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys, and people moved purposefully along the wooden sidewalks, going about their daily business. The stage pulled up in front of the general store with a final lurch and a cloud of dust. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as she gathered her belongings and prepared to step down into her new life. Through the window, she could see people beginning to gather, curious about the arriving passengers. "Good luck, honey," Miss Howard whispered, squeezing Clara's hand. "Remember, out here, people care more about what you can do than where you've been." Clara nodded gratefully and accepted the driver's assistance in climbing down from the stage. Her legs were unsteady after the long ride, and she swayed slightly as she found her footing on the wooden platform. The gathered crowd included several men who might have been Nathaniel Garrett, and she scanned their faces anxiously, looking for the kind eyes she remembered from the daguerreotype. A tall man in a dark coat stepped forward, removing his hat to reveal graying hair and a weathered face. Miss Bennett?" he asked, and Clara's heart sank as she realized this was indeed Nathaniel Garrett, and his expression was not what she had hoped to see. "Mr. Garrett," she replied, attempting a smile despite the growing dread in her stomach. It's wonderful to finally meet you." His eyes traveled slowly from her face down to her middle, where the carefully arranged shawl could no longer completely disguise her condition. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, and Clara felt the curious stares of the townspeople. Like a physical weight. "I think," Nathaniel Garrett said finally, his voice cold and formal, "we need to have a conversation in private." Clara's mouth went dry as cotton, the weight of every eye in the small crowd pressed down on her shoulders. Like stones. She nodded mutely, unable to trust her voice, and followed Nathaniel as he turned sharply on his heel and strode toward a small building that bore the sign, Silver Creek Land Office. The gathered townspeople parted before them like the Red Sea, their whispered conversations creating a buzzing undercurrent that made Clara's cheeks burn with shame. The land office was cramped and dusty, filled with surveying equipment and rolled maps. Nathaniel closed the door behind them with deliberate care, then turned to face her. In the confined space, he seemed even larger and more imposing than he had on the street. His jaw was set in a hard line, and the kindness she had imagined in his photographed eyes was nowhere to be found. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing to a wooden chair beside a cluttered desk. Clara perched on the edge of the seat, her carpet bag clutched in her lap like armor. Nathaniel remained standing, looming over her in a way that made her feel small and foolish. "I received your letters," he began, his voice carefully controlled. "Every one of them. You wrote eloquently about your domestic skills, your moral character, your desire for a simple frontier life. You spoke of being widowed, of seeking a fresh start in a place where the past couldn't follow you." Clara opened her mouth to speak, but Nathaniel held up a hand to silence her. "What you failed to mention," he continued, his tone growing sharper, "was your current condition. When exactly were you planning to enlighten me about the child you're carrying?" The words hit Clara like physical blows. She had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times during the long journey west, crafting careful explanations and gentle revelations, but faced with Nathaniel's cold anger, all her prepared speeches crumbled to dust. I was going to tell you," she stammered. "I wanted to explain everything properly once we had a chance to speak privately. I know how it must look, but if you'll just let me, how it looks." Nathaniel interrupted, his voice rising slightly before he caught himself, and lowered it again. "How it looks, Miss Bennett, is that you deliberately deceived me. You presented yourself as one thing while being quite another. Do you have any idea what this does to my reputation in this town?" Clara felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes, but she forced them back. She had not come this far to crumble at the first sign of difficulty. "Mr. Garrett, please. I understand your anger, and I know I should have been more forthcoming in my letters, but I am still the same woman who wrote to you. I can still cook and clean and manage a household. I can still be a good wife to you if you'll give me the chance." Nathaniel turned away from her, staring out the small window at the bustling main street beyond. "A wife comes to her husband without encumbrances, Miss Bennett. She comes clean and pure, ready to build a life together from the ground up. What you're offering is complicated." "The child will be here in 4 months," Clara said quietly. "I can work right up until the birth, and afterward, I'll be even more grateful for the security and protection you can provide. A grateful wife is a devoted wife, Mr. Garrett." He turned back to her, and for a moment, she thought she saw something soften in his expression, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the same cold calculation. "I'm a businessman, Miss Bennett. I own the largest general store in 3 counties, and I have investments in land and cattle that require careful management. My reputation is my most valuable asset. I cannot afford to be associated with scandal. "There's no scandal if we marry quickly," Clara said desperately. "People will assume the child is yours, conceived before I traveled west. It's not uncommon for mail-order brides to arrive already in a family way." Nathaniel laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Perhaps in some towns, Miss Bennett, but not in Silver Creek. This is a respectable community, founded on Christian principles and moral behavior. The people here expect their leading citizens to set an example." Clara stood slowly, her legs trembling with exhaustion and fear. "Then what are you saying, Mr. Garrett? That you're refusing to honor our agreement?" "I'm saying that our agreement was based on false pretenses. You misrepresented yourself, which voids any obligation I might have had." He moved to the door and placed his hand on the knob. "I'll provide you with lodging for tonight and stage fare back to wherever you came from. That's more than generous considering the circumstances." The dismissal hit Clara like a physical blow. She had expected anger, perhaps disappointment, but she had never truly believed that Nathaniel would send her away completely. The careful castle of hope she had built during the long journey west collapsed in an instant, leaving her standing in the ruins of her own desperate dreams. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking despite her efforts to remain composed. "I have nowhere else to go. No family, no money, no means of supporting myself. If you send me away, you're condemning both me and my child to whatever fate awaits women with no protection." Nathaniel's hand tightened on the doorknob, but he didn't open it. "That's not my responsibility, Miss Bennett. You created this situation through your own choices. I cannot be expected to rescue you from the consequences." Clara sank back into the chair, her strength finally abandoning her. The weight of her mistake pressed down on her like a mountain. She had risked everything in the hope that a stranger would accept her and her unborn child, and that gamble had failed spectacularly. "I see," she said quietly. "Then I suppose there's nothing more to discuss." Nathaniel opened the door, and the sounds of the busy street flooded into the small office. "Mrs. Gibson runs the boarding house on Maple Street. I'll speak to her about accommodating you for the night. The eastbound stage leaves tomorrow morning at 7. Clara gathered her carpet bag and stood on unsteady legs. The walk back to the main street felt like a march to the gallows, with every eye in town tracking her movements. The story of her rejection would spread through Silver Creek like wildfire. She knew by evening every soul in town would know about the fallen woman who had tried to trick their most prominent citizen into marriage. The boarding house was a 2-story frame building with peeling white paint and a sagging front porch. Mrs. Gibson was a thick-set woman with gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. She looked Clara up and down with the practiced gaze of someone who had seen every type of traveler and learned to assess their character and circumstances in a single glance. "Mr. Garrett sent word you'd be needing a room," she said without preamble. "One night only," he said. "That'll be 50 cents, meals included." Clara fumbled in her reticule for the coins, acutely aware that paying for the room would leave her with barely enough money for a single meal, let alone stage fare back east. Mrs. Gibson noticed her hesitation and raised an eyebrow. "Problem with the payment?" No problem," Clara said quickly, handing over the money. "Thank you for the accommodation." Mrs. Gibson led her up a narrow staircase to a small room under the eaves. It contained a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single chair beside a tiny window that looked out over the town's backyards and vegetable gardens. The walls were thin, and Clara could hear every creak and murmur from the other rooms. "Supper's at 6, Mrs. Gibson said. "Don't be late." Alone in the small room, Clara finally allowed herself to cry. The tears came in great silent sobs that shook her entire body. She pressed her face into the thin pillow to muffle the sound, her shoulders heaving with the force of her grief and fear. The baby moved restlessly inside her, as if sensing her distress, and she placed both hands over her belly in a protective gesture. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the child. "I'm so sorry I failed you before you're even born." The afternoon passed. Slowly, Clara sat by the window, watching the life of the town unfold below her. She saw children walking home from school, women hanging laundry on lines stretched between houses, men returning from their work in the fields and businesses. It was the kind of peaceful, orderly community she had dreamed of joining, but now she was nothing more than a curiosity, a cautionary tale about the dangers of deception. As evening approached, the smell of cooking food drifted up from the boarding house kitchen. Clara's stomach was cramped with hunger, but the thought of facing the other guests at the dinner table filled her with dread. Still, she needed to eat. For the sake of the baby, so she straightened her dress, pinched some color into her pale cheeks, and made her way downstairs. The dining room was small and cramped, with a single long table where the guests gathered for meals. Clara took the only empty chair at the far end, near the kitchen door, and tried to make herself as inconspicuous as possible. The other guests included a traveling salesman, an elderly woman visiting her daughter, and a young couple who appeared to be newlyweds. Conversation was stilted and awkward, with frequent glances in Clara's direction. She ate quickly and quietly, focusing on her plate and avoiding eye contact with anyone else. But as she was finishing her meal, the salesman, a florid man with a booming voice, decided to satisfy his curiosity. "You're the young lady who came in on today's stage, aren't you?" he asked loudly. "Here to marry Nate Garrett?" Clara's fork clattered against her plate. Yes, I was. The man's eyebrows shot up with interest. "Don't tell me old Nate changed his mind. That would be a first. He's usually sharp as a tack when it comes to business deals." The elderly woman made a disapproving sound. "Mr. Jensen, it's hardly appropriate to pry into the young lady's personal affairs." But Jensen was not to be deterred. "Oh, come now, Mrs. Whitman. News travels fast in a town this size. Half of Silver Creek already knows the arrangement fell through. I'm just curious about the particulars." Clara pushed back from the table, her appetite completely gone. "If you'll excuse me, I'm rather tired from the journey." She fled upstairs before anyone could respond, leaving behind a dining room full of curious whispers and speculative glances. In her small room, she paced the narrow space like a caged animal, her mind racing through increasingly desperate possibilities. She could not return to Boston. She had no money for the fare, and even if she did, Mrs. Winters would never take her back in her condition. She could try to find work in Silver Creek, but what respectable business would hire a pregnant woman? With no local references? The alternatives were too horrible to contemplate. As darkness fell over the town, Clara sat by her window and watched the lights come on in the houses below. Behind those warm, glowing windows were families gathering for evening meals, children being tucked into beds, husbands and wives sharing the quiet intimacies of domestic life. It was everything she had dreamed of, everything she had risked her last dollar to achieve, and it was as far away as the stars. The baby moved again, more vigorously this time, and Clara rubbed her belly in slow circles. "What are we going to do, little one?" she whispered. "What are we going to do?" Outside, a church bell tolled the hour, its bronze voice carrying across the sleeping town like a prayer or a warning. Tomorrow would bring the eastbound stage and another journey into uncertainty. Tonight was all she had left of her dreams of a new life in the Western Territories, and she intended to spend every moment of it holding on to hope, however fragile it might be. Dawn came too early, creeping through the thin curtains of Clara's room like an unwelcome visitor. She had barely slept, spending most of the night sitting in the hard wooden chair, staring out at the dark streets of Silver Creek and trying to conjure some miracle that might save her from the approaching disaster. Her back ached from the uncomfortable position, and her eyes burned from unshed tears and exhaustion. The sound of footsteps in the hallway told her that other guests were beginning to stir. Soon Mrs. Gibson would be calling everyone down for breakfast, and after that, the eastbound stage would arrive to carry her away from her last hope of respectability. Clara pressed her hands against her swollen belly, feeling the child's restless movements, and whispered another apology to the life growing within her. A sharp knock at her door made her jump. "Miss Bennett?" Mrs. Gibson's voice carried through the thin wood. "Mr. Garrett is here to see you. He's waiting in the parlor." Clara's heart leaped with sudden, desperate hope. Perhaps Nathaniel had reconsidered. Perhaps the night had brought him to his senses, made him realize that a practical arrangement could benefit them, both despite the circumstances. She quickly splashed cold water on her face, pinched color into her cheeks, and smoothed her wrinkled dress as best she could. The parlor was a small, stuffy room filled with horsehair furniture and doilies. Nathaniel stood with his back to the door, hands clasped behind him, staring out the front window at the awakening street. He had dressed carefully for this meeting, Clara noticed. His coat was brushed, his boots polished, his hair neatly combed. He looked like a man preparing for an important business transaction. "Mr. Garrett," Clara said softly, closing the door. Behind her, I wasn't expecting to see you this morning." He turned slowly, and Clara's fragile hope withered at the sight of his expression. There was no warmth there, no indication that he had suffered a change of heart during the night. If anything, he looked more resolved than he had the day before. "Eleanor, these grants can be substantial, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars for significant historical sites. If we can prove your well was part of Nevada's gold rush infrastructure, it could qualify for preservation funding that might help with your current financial challenges." The possibility seemed too convenient, too perfectly timed to address our desperate situation. How would we even begin to prove something like that? We have no documentation of a stage station here, no family stories about it. Just an unusually large well that might or might not have been something else a century and a half ago. We'd need to conduct a proper archaeological investigation, Megan explained, her academic enthusiasm building as she outlined the process. Ground-penetrating radar to look for associated structures, careful excavation around the well, too. Search for artifacts, and most definitively, we'd need to drain and examine the well itself. "Drain the well?" I repeated, surprised by the suggestion. "It's been dry for decades. What would draining accomplish?" "Wells often contain centuries of accumulated sediment," Megan explained. "That sediment can trap and preserve artifacts that tell us about the structure's original purpose and use. If this was a stagecoach maintenance pit before becoming a well, there might be evidence tools, parts from coaches, personal items from travelers, buried in the sediment at the bottom." The idea of draining and excavating Old Homestead well felt strangely intrusive, as though we were disturbing a piece of our family history. The well had stood unchanged for generations, a constant reminder of Rebecca's determination and foresight. The thought of archaeological teams digging through it, treating it as a research site rather than a family landmark, was unsettling. "I know it's a lot to consider," Megan said gently, reading my hesitation. "But the grant would cover all costs of the investigation, and if we find evidence confirming my theory, it could lead to substantial preservation funding. Funding that might help address some of the financial challenges you're facing." That evening, I discussed Megan's theory with my parents. We sat on the front porch as the sun set behind the Sierra Nevada, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The drought-parched landscape looked almost beautiful in the golden evening light, though we all knew the dry conditions were slowly destroying our operation. "An old stagecoach station," Dad mused, considering the possibility with the intellectual curiosity that had always characterized his approach to ranching. The heart attack had left Mom more dependent on others for major decisions, but her mind remained sharp, particularly when it came to family history. "There's nothing in Rebecca's journals about a stage station," Mom said, carefully turning the pages of the leather-bound book that contained our founder's handwritten accounts. She describes digging the well with help from neighboring settlers, but doesn't mention any existing structure. Maybe she didn't know, I suggested. The stagecoach line had been abandoned for 7 years before she arrived. If the station buildings were gone and only the maintenance pit remained, she might have simply seen a partially completed well. Dad nodded thoughtfully. That makes sense. Abandoned structures wouldn't last long in this environment. Settlers would salvage the lumber and materials for their own use. By the time Rebecca arrived, the only evidence of the station might have been that circular stone foundation. But draining the well? Mom questioned, her voice carrying the weight of family tradition. That well has been part of our ranch since the beginning. It feels wrong to disturb it, even for historical research. We might not have a choice, Dad reminded her gently. If Megan's grant could provide enough funding to help with your medical bills or the irrigation system, we need to consider it. The alternative is selling the East Ridge, which would be a far more permanent loss to the ranch. The decision to allow the archaeological investigation wasn't made lightly. We spent a week researching historical preservation grants, consulting with other ranchers who had participated in similar projects, and exploring potential outcomes. I contacted our bank, hoping that the possibility of preservation funding might improve our chances for a loan extension. Our banker, Michael Chun, had worked with agricultural clients throughout Nevada for over 25 years. He understood the ranching business and the thin margins that characterized most family operations, but even he was skeptical about our ability to secure additional financing given our current situation. Eleanor, I appreciate the historical significance of what you're proposing, he said during our meeting, his tone sympathetic but realistic. But you're already leveraged to the maximum on your existing property. Without additional collateral or a significant improvement in cash flow, I can't recommend extending more credit. But he also recognized the potential value of the historical investigation. On the other hand, if this archaeological project secures preservation funding, it could significantly improve your financial position. That kind of grant money doesn't have to be repaid, which would free up your existing cash flow for loan servicing. In the end, Megan's proposal proved to be our only viable option. The Nevada State Historic Preservation Office approved an initial grant of $45,000 for the archaeological investigation, with the possibility of much larger preservation funding if the site proved historically significant. 2 weeks later, the archaeological team arrived at Whispering Pines Ranch. Nevada Historical Archaeology Associates specialized in gold rush-era sites and had worked on similar projects throughout the state. Their lead archaeologist, Dr. Thomas Rodriguez, was a soft-spoken man with sun-weathered skin and the careful movements of someone accustomed to handling fragile historical artifacts. "This is a remarkable structure," he said as he examined Old Homestead Well, his experienced eyes noting details I'd never considered. The stonework is consistent with late 1860s construction techniques, and the diameter is typical of maintenance pits used by the Pioneer Stage Company during that period. Dr. Rodriguez explained that the investigation would proceed in stages, beginning with non-invasive ground-penetrating radar surveys around the well to identify any associated structures or features that might remain below the surface. "I've built my reputation in this community through careful attention to propriety and moral behavior. I cannot jeopardize that for a temporary impulse of charity." "Is that what this would have been?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Charity?" Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost regretful. "Perhaps in different circumstances. But we must deal with the world as it is, not as we might wish it to be." A commotion outside drew their attention to the window. The eastbound stage was rattling down Main Street, kicking up clouds of dust and announcing its arrival with the driver's shouted greetings to early rising townspeople. Clara watched it approach with the same feeling she might have watching her own funeral procession. "You should gather your belongings," Nathaniel said, stepping away from the window. "The stage won't wait long." Clara picked up the purse with trembling fingers. The leather was soft and well made, probably more expensive than any personal item she had ever owned. Will you tell people what really happened? Why I'm leaving?" Nathaniel considered this carefully. "I'll say that upon further consideration. We decided we weren't well suited to each other. That's the truth, in its way." It was a kindness, Clara realized. A small one, but a kindness nonetheless. The truth that she had deceived him about her pregnancy would follow her reputation like a black cloud, making it impossible for her to start over anywhere else. This version would at least preserve some shred of her dignity. "Thank you," she said simply. Nathaniel nodded and moved toward the door. "I wish you well, Miss Bennett. Truly I do. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for." After he left, Clara sat alone in the parlor for several minutes, listening to the sounds of the stage preparations, outside horses being unhitched and watered, passengers disembarking and stretching their legs, luggage being loaded and unloaded, the familiar rhythm of frontier travel that had brought her here and would now carry her away. Mrs. Gibson appeared in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "Stage'll be ready to leave in 20 minutes. You'll want to get your things together." Clara climbed the stairs to her room one last time, moving like a woman in a dream. She packed her few belongings mechanically, folding her spare dress and undergarments with the same careful attention she had given them when preparing for her journey west. Everything had to fit in the carpet bag. There was no room for sentiment or excess. As she was closing the bag, her fingers brushed against something wrapped in tissue paper at the bottom. She pulled it out carefully and unwrapped it, revealing a small silver locket that had belonged to her mother. Inside was a tiny portrait of her father, painted when her parents were first married. Their faces looked so young and hopeful, so certain that their love could overcome any obstacle. Clara fastened the locket around her neck and tucked it beneath her collar. Whatever happened next, she would carry their memory with her, and perhaps their love would give her strength for the trials ahead. The stage was indeed ready when she came downstairs, the fresh horses stamping and snorting in their eagerness to be moving. The same grizzled driver who had brought her to Silver Creek was preparing for the return journey, checking harnesses and securing luggage with practiced efficiency. Well, he said when he saw Clara approaching. "Didn't expect to see you heading back so soon. Things didn't work out with your gentleman friend." "No," Clara said quietly. "They didn't work out." The driver studied her face with shrewd eyes that had seen every variety of human disappointment. "Well, that's the way of it sometimes. Frontier life ain't for everyone, and not every arrangement turns out like folks hope." Clara climbed into the stage with his assistance, taking a seat by the window so she could watch Silver Creek disappear. Behind them, the other passengers were already settled, a merchant returning to St. Louis, an elderly farmer visiting family, and a young woman who looked barely out of her teens and kept glancing at Clara with curious sympathy. As the stage rolled into motion, Clara caught a glimpse of Nathaniel Garrett standing in front of his general store, watching their departure. For just a moment, their eyes met through the dusty window, and she thought she saw something that might have been regret in his expression, but then the stage turned a corner, and he was gone. The journey back toward St. Louis passed in a blur of prairie grass and scattered settlements. Clara spoke little, responding to her fellow passengers' attempts at conversation with polite but brief answers. The young woman, who introduced herself as Mary Fletcher, seemed particularly interested in befriending her. "I'm traveling to Jefferson City to work as a governess," Mary confided during one of their stops to change horses. "It's my first position, and I'm terribly nervous about it." "Have you ever worked as a governess?" "No," Clara replied. "I was a seamstress before I came west." "Oh, how wonderful." "I've always admired women who can sew well. It's such a practical skill. Mary's eyes dropped briefly to Clara's midsection, then away again. Will you be returning to seamstress work? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken implications. Clara knew that Mary had guessed her condition. It was becoming increasingly difficult to hide, especially in the close quarters of the stagecoach, but the girl's tone held no judgment, only genuine curiosity and perhaps a touch of concern. "I'm not certain what I'll do," Clara admitted. "I'm afraid my circumstances have become complicated." Mary nodded understanding. The world can be very unkind to women in difficult situations. I've seen it myself, growing up in a small town. But I've also seen women find ways to survive, and even thrive despite everything working against them. That evening, they stopped at a way station that consisted of little more than a log cabin and a barn. The accommodations were rough, with all the passengers sharing a single large room divided by hanging blankets. Clara lay on her narrow cot, listening to the wind howl across the prairie and feeling the baby's movements grow stronger and more frequent. She tried to plan her next steps, but every possibility seemed to lead to a dead end. She had no money beyond what Nathaniel had given her, no family to turn to, no prospects for employment in her condition. The charitable institutions in Boston might take her in, but only temporarily, and the thought of raising her child in such circumstances filled her with despair. During the second day of travel, they encountered a group of westbound immigrants whose wagon had broken down. The stage driver stopped to offer assistance, and Clara watched through the window as families worked together to repair their damaged vehicle. Children played in the grass while their parents labored, and she could hear laughter and cheerful conversation drifting on the wind. "They look so hopeful," Mary observed, following Clara's gaze. "Like they truly believe they're heading towards something better." "Perhaps they are," Clara replied, looking down at Hope's tiny face. "Perhaps hope is easier when you're traveling with people who love you." Mary was quiet for a moment. "You don't have anyone, do you? No family waiting for you back east?" Clara shook her head. "I'm quite alone in the world." "Then perhaps," Mary said carefully, "you shouldn't be so quick to give up on the West. Not all men are like the one who rejected you. There are good people out there, people who value kindness and loyalty over social conventions." Clara wanted to believe her, but the sting of Nathaniel's rejection was still too fresh, too painful. She had risked everything in the hope that someone would want her despite her circumstances, and that hope had been crushed so thoroughly that she wasn't sure she could ever trust in such possibilities again. On the third day, they reached a fork in the road where the eastbound stage would continue toward St. Louis, and a northbound stage would head toward the mining settlements in the Dakota Territory. As they pulled into the station for the midday meal and change of horses, Clara felt her stomach tighten with anxiety. Soon, she would have to make a decision about her destination, and she still had no clear idea what that should be. The station was busier than most they had stopped at, with several stages coming and going at once. Travelers crowded the rough dining room, sharing tables and exchanging news of the territories. Clara sat alone at a corner table, picking at a plate of beans and salt pork, her mind too full of worry to have much appetite. She was so lost in thought that she didn't notice the man watching her from across the room until he stood up and approached her table. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting and clothes that spoke of frontier practicality rather than city fashion. His coat was clean but worn, his boots scuffed but well-maintained. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, removing his hat politely. "I couldn't help noticing you seem troubled. Is there anything I might do to help?" Clara looked up, startled by the direct approach from a stranger. The man's face was weathered by sun and wind, but his eyes were kind, and there was something in his expression, a quiet strength, perhaps that made her hesitate before dismissing him. "That's very kind of you, sir, but I'm afraid my troubles aren't the sort that can be easily remedied by a stranger's assistance. The man nodded, as if he had expected such an answer. I understand. Sometimes the burdens we carry are ours alone. He hesitated, then added, I'm Matthew Harper. Run a small ranch about 50 miles north of here, near a settlement called Pine Ridge. Clara studied his face, trying to discern his intentions. There was no guile in his expression, only a straightforward openness that was refreshing after the calculated politeness of Nathaniel Garrett. Clara Bennett, she replied. Finally, I'm traveling. East, Matthew repeated thoughtfully. Back to family? No, Clara admitted. I have no family waiting for me. Matthew seemed about to say something more when a small voice called out, Pun, quick. A boy of perhaps 8 or 9 came running into the dining room, his face flushed with excitement. The blacksmith says he's fixed the wagon wheel, but we need to pay him extra for the new rim. Matthew turned to the child with a patient smile. Tell Mr. Jenkins I'll be right there, Jacob. As the boy dashed back outside, Matthew explained, My son. We lost his mother to fever 2 years ago. It's been just the 2 of us since then. Clara felt a sudden, unexpected connection to this man who was raising a child alone in the wilderness. I'm sorry for your loss, she said softly. Thank you, it's been challenging. Jacob needs a mother's influence, something I can't provide no matter how hard I try. Matthew hesitated, then added in a rush, Miss Bennett, I know this is forward of me, but I've been looking for a companion. Someone who might be willing to help manage a household and provide some maternal guidance for Jacob. Clara stared at him, not quite comprehending what he was suggesting. Mr. Harper, you don't even know me. I know enough, he said simply. I can see you're a woman of education and refinement, even in your current circumstances. And I can see that you're expecting a child. His eyes dropped briefly to her midsection, then back to her face without a trace of judgment. In my experience, a woman traveling alone in your condition is likely facing limited options. The directness of his assessment should have offended her, but there was something refreshingly honest about Matthew Harper that made it impossible to take offense. You're suggesting what exactly? Clara asked cautiously. A practical arrangement. Matthew replied. You need security and a home for yourself and your child. I need help with my son and my household. It wouldn't have to be. That is, we could maintain separate sleeping quarters until we know each other better. Clara was speechless. After Nathaniel Garrett's rejection, after being made to feel like damaged goods unworthy of a respectable man's consideration, here was someone offering her exactly what she needed, without conditions or recriminations. Why would you do this? She asked finally. Take in a woman carrying another man's child? Matthew's expression softened. Because I know what it's like to face the world alone with a child to protect. Because Jacob deserves a mother, and your baby deserves a father. And because out here, Miss Bennett, we can't afford the luxury of judging others for their past mistakes. We survive by helping each other. Clara looked into his eyes and saw only sincerity there, a straightforward decency that spoke more eloquently than any flowery declarations of Nathaniel Garrett ever had. I need to think about this, she said quietly. Of course. The northbound stage leaves in an hour. If you decide to accept my offer, I'll be waiting by the ticket office. Matthew placed his hat back on his head and gave her a respectful nod. Whatever you decide, I wish you well, Miss Bennett. As he walked away, Clara sat motionless, her mind racing. Matthew Harper's offer seemed too good to be true. A home, security, a father for her child, all without demands or expectations, beyond what she could reasonably provide. But she had been deceived before by men with golden words and empty promises. William Harrington had seemed sincere too, until he disappeared without a trace. Clara left the dining room and found Mary Fletcher sitting on a bench outside, enjoying the sunshine. You look like you've seen a ghost, Mary observed. What happened in there? Clara sat beside her and related her conversation with Matthew Harper. Mary listened attentively, her expression thoughtful. It sounds too convenient, Mary said finally. But I've heard of such arrangements before. Out here, practical considerations often outweigh social niceties. A man with a child needs a wife, and a woman in your condition needs protection. It could be a genuine offer. Or it could be another trap, Clara said softly. Another man who will reject me once he learns the full truth about me. What truth is that? Mary asked gently. That you made a mistake? That you trusted someone who didn't deserve your trust? We've all done that, Clara. The question is whether you'll let that mistake define the rest of your life. Clara gazed across the station yard, where Matthew was speaking with the blacksmith, one hand resting protectively on his son's shoulder. There was something in the way he interacted with the boy, patient, attentive, but firm, that spoke of a man who took his responsibilities seriously. I don't know if I can trust again, Clara whispered. After William's betrayal, after Nathaniel's rejection, I'm not sure I have the courage to risk another disappointment. Mary took her hand and squeezed it gently. The way I see it, you have two choices. You can get on that eastbound stage and return to a place where your past will always define you. Or you can take a chance on building something new with a man who seems to care more about your future than your history. The station bell rang, announcing the imminent departure of the stages. Clara stood, her heart pounding. This was the moment of decision, the fork in the road that would determine the course of her life and her child's future. Whatever you decide, Mary said, rising to embrace her. I wish you all the happiness in the world, Clara Bennett. You deserve it. Clara hugged her new friend tightly, drawing strength from the unexpected kindness. Thank you, Mary, for everything. As Mary boarded the eastbound stage, Clara stood in the yard, watching the passengers climb aboard, listening to the driver's shouts and the creak of leather as the horses were harnessed. The moment stretched, taut with possibility and fear. Then, slowly, deliberately, Clara turned and walked toward the northbound stage, where Matthew Harper waited by the ticket office, his son fidgeting beside him. When he saw her approaching, a smile spread across his weathered face, not triumphant or smug, but relieved, as if he had been afraid she wouldn't come. Miss Bennett, he said, removing his hat. Does this mean? It means I'm willing to try, Clara replied, meeting his gaze steadily. But I need you to understand something. I won't be treated as charity or as a convenient solution to your domestic problems. If this is to work, it must be a partnership of equals. Matthew nodded solemnly. I wouldn't have it any other way. And the child, Clara continued, placing a protective hand over her belly. You should know that I plan to be honest with him or her about their origins when the time comes. I won't build our relationship on lies. Of course, Matthew agreed. Truth is always better than deception, even when it's difficult. Clara took a deep breath, feeling strangely lighter than she had in months. Then I accept your offer, Mr. Harper. Matthew's smile widened, and he turned to his son. Jacob, this is Miss Bennett. She's going to be coming home with us to help take care of the house and to be your new mother. The boy studied Clara with serious eyes, taking in her travel-worn appearance and her obvious pregnancy. Is the baby going to be my brother or sister? He asked bluntly. Clara exchanged a glance with Matthew, who nodded encouragingly. Yes, Jacob, she said softly. If that's all right with you. Jacob considered this for a moment, then nodded with the decisiveness of childhood. That's good. I've been wanting a brother. Pau says I need someone to teach about fishing and tracking. It might be his sister, Clara cautioned, charmed despite herself by the boy's matter-of-fact acceptance. Jacob shrugged. That's all right too. Girls can fish if they want to. Matthew laughed, a warm, rich sound that seemed to vibrate through the cool autumn air. Well, that's settled then. Let's get your ticket, Miss Bennett. Pine Ridge awaits. As they boarded the northbound stage, Clara felt a curious mixture of trepidation and hope. She was traveling into the unknown once more, but this time, she wasn't alone. This time, she had a clear destination and a man who seemed to value honesty and practicality over social conventions. The stage rattled out of the station and onto the northern road, leaving behind the path that would have taken Clara back to Boston and her old life. Through the window, she watched the landscape change, becoming more rugged and dramatic with each passing mile. Beside her, Jacob chattered excitedly about the ranch, the horses, the room that would be hers, and all the things he wanted to show her when they arrived. Across from them, Matthew watched with quiet satisfaction, occasionally adding details, or gently correcting his son's more fanciful descriptions. His eyes met Clara's from time to time, conveying a wordless reassurance that she had made the right choice. As the sun began to set, painting the rolling prairie in shades of gold and amber, Clara felt the baby move within her, a strong, decisive kick that seemed to underscore the rightness of her decision. For the first time since discovering her pregnancy, she allowed herself to imagine a future where her child would be welcomed, where they would both have a place to belong. The road ahead would not be easy, she harbored no illusions about that. There would be challenges, misunderstandings, and difficult conversations. Matthew Harper was still a stranger, and his offer of marriage was based on practicality rather than passion. But there was something solid about him, something trustworthy that made Clara believe this arrangement might evolve into something more meaningful than her romantic fantasies had ever been. As darkness fell and Jacob dozed against her shoulder, Matthew leaned forward and spoke softly, so as not to wake his son. "I want you to know, Miss Bennett, that I don't expect anything from you that you're not ready to give. This will be a true partnership with respect on both sides." Clara studied his face in the dim light of the stage lanterns, noting the crow's feet at the corners of his eyes, the firmness of his jaw, the quiet strength in his gaze. "Thank you, Mr. Harper. That means more than you know." "Matthew," he corrected gently. "If we're to be partners, you should use my given name." "Matthew," Clara repeated, testing the sound of it. "And you must call me Clara." He smiled, and in that smile, Clara saw the possibility of happiness, of a life rebuilt from the ashes of disappointment and betrayal. It wasn't the romantic love she had once dreamed of, but perhaps it was something more enduring, a bond forged in mutual need and strengthened by shared purpose. As the stage rolled northward through the gathering darkness, carrying them toward Pine Ridge and their shared future, Clara felt a sense of peace settle over her. For the first time in months, she wasn't running away from something, but moving toward something, a home, a family, a chance to begin again. Pine Ridge proved to be little more than a cluster of buildings nestled in a valley between rolling hills. But to Clara, it might as well have been a grand metropolis after days of endless prairie. The stage pulled up before a modest general store, where a small gathering of townspeople awaited its arrival with the eager curiosity of those for whom any new visitor was cause for excitement. "This is it," Matthew said, helping Jacob down from the coach before offering his hand to Clara. "Not much to look at, but it's home." Clara accepted his assistance, grateful for the steady support as she navigated the high step down from the stage. Her legs were stiff from the long journey, and her back ached fiercely, reminders of her advancing pregnancy. As her feet touched the ground, she felt the weight of curious stares from the assembled onlookers. Matthew must have sensed her discomfort, for he placed a protective hand at her elbow and turned to face the gathering. "Folks, I'd like you to meet Miss Clara Bennett. She's agreed to become my wife and a mother to Jacob." A murmur ran through the small crowd, and Clara braced herself for the judgment and whispered speculation she had experienced in Silver Creek. Instead, a plump woman with gray-streaked hair stepped forward, her face wreathed in a welcoming smile. "Well, it's about time, Matthew Harper. That boy of yours needs a mother's touch, and you could use someone to remind you there's more to life than cattle and timber." The woman turned to Clara, enveloping her in a surprisingly strong embrace. "I'm Sarah Miller, dear. I run the mercantile with my husband Frank. We're so pleased to have you in Pine Ridge." One by one, the townspeople came forward to introduce themselves: the blacksmith and his wife, the schoolteacher, the young doctor who served the entire county, the minister and his family. Each greeting was marked by genuine warmth and a refreshing absence of probing questions about her past or her condition. "They seem kind," Clara remarked softly to Matthew as they collected her trunk from the stage. "Pine Ridge folks know what it means to survive by helping each other," Matthew replied. "Most everyone here has a story they'd rather not tell, a past they've come to the frontier to escape. We don't ask questions because we don't want others asking ours." The wagon ride to the Harper Ranch took nearly an hour, following a winding trail that climbed steadily into the foothills. Jacob, excited to be home after their journey, pointed out landmarks with proprietary pride: the creek where he caught his first fish, the old oak where a family of raccoons made their home, the rocky outcropping that resembled a sleeping bear if you squinted just right. Clara listened to his chatter with growing affection, touched by his eager desire to welcome her into his world. There was an innocence about Jacob, an openness that hadn't been dimmed by the loss of his mother, and she found herself hoping that her own child might possess the same resilient spirit. The ranch itself appeared suddenly as they crested a hillock. Sturdy log house with a wide porch, a large barn, and several outbuildings, all nestled in a meadow ringed by pine forest. Smoke curled from the chimney, and lamplight glowed in the windows, signs that someone awaited their arrival. "My foreman's wife, Mrs. Callahan, has been keeping house while we were gone," Matthew explained as he helped Clara down from the wagon. "She's a fine cook, but not much for cleaning or mending, I'm afraid." The front door flew open, and a small, wiry woman with iron-gray hair emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. "About time you got back," she called, her voice carrying a musical Irish lilt. "The stew's near boiled away to nothing, and I've a husband wondering if I've run off to join the theater." "Mrs. Callahan, this is Miss Bennett," Matthew said, guiding Clara forward. "She be joining our household as my wife." The older woman's sharp eyes took in Clara's condition at a glance, but her expression remained unchanged. "Well, glory be, it's about time you showed some sense, Matthew Harper. A man and a boy alone is an invitation to disaster, as I've been telling you these past 2 years." She extended a work-roughened hand to Clara. "Mary Callahan, at your service, miss. And might I say, you're a sight more refined than I expected this one to bring home from his travels." Clara couldn't help but smile at the woman's forthright manner. "I'm pleased to meet you, Mrs. Callahan, and grateful for your care of the house." "Don't be too grateful until you've seen it," Mary snorted. "I can cook a meal that would make angels weep, but housekeeping was never my calling. Now come inside before you catch your death in this evening chill. You look dead on your feet. Poor lamb." The interior of the house was exactly as Mrs. Callahan had implied: clean enough, but decidedly lacking a woman's touch. The main room served as both parlor and dining area, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall. A sturdy table and chairs occupied the center of the space, while a worn sofa and 2 mismatched armchairs clustered near the hearth. The walls were bare save for a single landscape painting and a rifle mounted above the mantel. A delicious aroma emanated from the kitchen, and Clara realized she was ravenous. The stagecoach meals had been meager and unappetizing, and she had eaten little in the past few days. "Sit yourself down," Mrs. Callahan commanded, gesturing toward the table. "You'll want a hot meal and a proper cup of tea after that dreadful journey. Stage travel is no condition for a woman in your state." Within minutes, they were seated around the table, bowls of hearty beef stew and slices of fresh bread before them. Jacob, despite his excitement, remembered his manners and waited for everyone to be served before diving in with the enthusiasm of a growing boy. Matthew ate more sedately, his eyes occasionally drifting to Clara, as if to reassure himself that she was really there. "I've prepared the east bedroom for Miss Bennett," Mrs. Callahan announced as she poured tea. "It gets the morning sun, which is a blessing in winter. The bedding's fresh, and I aired out the room proper." "Thank you, Mrs. Callahan," Matthew said. "That's very thoughtful." "Well, someone has to think of such things," the older woman replied tartly. "Left to you men, the poor girl would be sleeping on a straw pallet with horse blankets." After dinner, while Jacob helped Mrs. Callahan clear the table, Matthew showed Clara to her room. It was simply furnished with a bed, a washstand, a small dresser, and a rocking chair near the window. Someone, Mrs. Callahan, presumably had placed a vase of wildflowers on the dresser, a touch that brought unexpected tears to Clara's eyes. "It's not much," Matthew said apologetically, misinterpreting her emotion, "but we can make improvements. Whatever you need to be comfortable." "It's perfect," Clara assured him, blinking back the tears. "Truly, I haven't had a room of my own since, in a very long time." Matthew nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. "Well, I'll leave you to settle in. You must be exhausted. We can discuss arrangements in the morning." After he left, Clara sat on the edge of the bed, overwhelmed by the swift change in her circumstances. Just days ago she had been facing a return journey to Boston in disgrace, with no prospects and no hope for her future or her child's. Now she found herself in a comfortable home with a man who seemed genuinely kind, his son who had accepted her without question, and a community that appeared willing to embrace her without judgment. It seemed too good to be true, and experience had taught Clara to be wary of unexpected blessings. Yet there was something undeniably solid about Matthew Harper, something trustworthy that made her want to believe that perhaps, just this once, fortune had smiled upon her. She unpacked her meager belongings, arranging them carefully in the dresser drawers. The baby moved restlessly within her, as if sensing the significance of this new beginning. Clara placed a hand over the movement, whispering a quiet promise to the child that whatever happened next, they would face it together. Sleep claimed her almost as soon as her head touched the pillow, a deep, dreamless rest untroubled by the anxieties that had plagued her for so many months. Morning arrived with a chorus of birdsong and the enticing aroma of coffee and frying bacon. Clara dressed quickly in her second-best dress, a dark green cotton that had seen better days but still retained its shape. She pinned her hair in a simple knot at the nape of her neck and studied her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. The woman who looked back at her seemed different, somehow less haunted, perhaps the shadows beneath her eyes less pronounced. There was color in her cheeks that hadn't been there the day before, and a steadiness in her gaze that spoke of renewed purpose. In the kitchen, she found Jacob already at the table, attacking a plate of eggs and bacon with the single-minded focus of boyhood. Matthew stood at the stove, his sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms, as he tended a cast-iron skillet. "Good morning," Clara said softly. Matthew turned, a smile lighting his features when he saw her. "Good morning. I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in months," Clara admitted. "Something about the mountain air, perhaps." "Or perhaps the knowledge that you're safe," Matthew suggested, setting a plate before her. "Eat while it's hot. We've much to discuss today." Over breakfast, Matthew outlined his proposal in more specific terms. They would be married by the minister in Pine Ridge as soon as the arrangements could be made within the week, if Clara was agreeable. Until then, she would occupy the east bedroom, while Matthew would continue to sleep in the room he shared with Jacob. "After the wedding," he explained, a slight flush coloring his weathered cheeks, "we can discuss more permanent arrangements. As I said before, I expect nothing from you that you're not ready to give." "And the child?" Clara asked, one hand instinctively moving to her belly. Matthew's expression softened. "The child will be raised as our own, with all the love and care we can provide." No one in Pine Ridge need ever know that I'm not the father. But won't they wonder? Clara pressed. The timing will be obvious to anyone who can count. Let them wonder, Matthew said simply. Out here, a man's business is his own, and his family is sacred. Anyone foolish enough to voice speculation will find themselves unwelcome in polite company. And Jacob? Clara glanced at the boy, who was listening to the conversation with undisguised interest. What will we tell him? Matthew looked at his son thoughtfully. Jacob deserves the truth, or as much of it as he can understand at his age. He turned to the boy. Jacob, Miss Bennett is going to have a baby soon. This baby will be your brother or sister, and we will love it just as much as we love you. But I want you to understand that I didn't put the baby in Miss Bennett's tummy the way most fathers do. The baby's father was unable to care for Miss Bennett or the child. So I've asked her to be part of our family instead. Jacob considered this information with a seriousness that belied his years. Like when Mr. Miller took in those orphaned lambs last spring. Their mama died, but he found them a new one, Matthew chuckled. Something like that, yes. Jacob nodded, satisfied. With this explanation, that's good. Everybody needs a family. The simple wisdom of the child's words brought unexpected tears to Clara's eyes. Yes, she agreed softly. Everyone needs a family. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity as Clara settled into her new role in the Harper household. There were linens to be aired, cupboards to be organized, mending to be done, all the small tasks that had been neglected in the absence of a woman's touch. Mrs. Callahan came daily to help with the heavier work and to teach Clara the particular ways of managing a frontier household. It's not like those fancy Eastern homes, the older woman explained as they worked together in the kitchen. Out here, you learn to make do with what you have and to waste nothing. Every scrap, every thread, every drop has value. Clara found herself enjoying the physical labor, the sense of purpose it gave her after months of uncertainty. Each curtain she hung, each meal she prepared, each tear she mended in Jacob's clothing was an affirmation of her place in this new life. Matthew, true to his word, maintained a respectful distance, never pressing for more intimacy than she was ready to give. He was unfailingly kind, attentive to her needs, and quick to express appreciation for her contributions to the household. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire after Jacob was asleep, talking of small, everyday matters, the weather, the livestock, the comings and goings of Pine Ridge residents. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, Clara found herself relaxing in Matthew's company, looking forward to those quiet conversations, to the sound of his deep, measured voice, to the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. He was nothing like William Harrington with his glib charm, nor like Nathaniel Garrett with his rigid propriety. Matthew Harper was simply himself, honest, direct, and steadfast. The wedding took place on a crisp autumn morning in the small, white church that served the Pine Ridge community. Clara wore her blue silk dress, carefully altered by Mrs. Miller to accommodate her pregnancy, and carried a bouquet of late-blooming wildflowers that Jacob had gathered for her. Matthew, freshly shaved and dressed in his Sunday best, waited for her at the altar, his expression a mixture of pride and tenderness that caught at Clara's heart. The ceremony was brief and simple, witnessed by a small gathering of Pine Ridge residents who had already embraced Clara as one of their own. The minister spoke of partnership and mutual respect, rather than the traditional wifely submission, a departure from convention that Clara suspected Matthew had requested specifically for her benefit. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared, and Matthew leaned down to place a gentle, almost reverent kiss on Clara's lips, their first such intimacy, chaste but full of promise. The community celebration that followed was joyous and unpretentious, a meal shared in the churchyard, music provided by a fiddler and a harmonica player, dancing on the grass despite the autumn chill. Clara, too unwieldy now for dancing, sat with the older women, accepting their congratulations and well wishes with growing confidence. Mrs. Miller leaned close at one point, her voice pitched for Clara's ears alone. "You've brought light back to that man's eyes, my dear. After Rachel died, we feared Matthew might never recover. Now look at him smiling, laughing. You're a blessing to him and that boy, no matter what circumstances brought you here." Clara watched as Matthew swung Jacob in a circle, their laughter carrying across the churchyard. "They're a blessing to me as well," she said softly. "I never expected to find this." That night, after they returned to the ranch, their home now, truly hers as much as Matthew's, Clara faced the moment she had both anticipated and dreaded. The question of sleeping arrangements had remained delicately unaddressed, but now, as husband and wife, they could no longer avoid the subject. Matthew solved the dilemma with characteristic straightforwardness. "I've prepared the main bedroom for you," he said as they stood somewhat awkwardly in the parlor. "I can continue to use the small room off the kitchen until you feel ready for more." Clara studied his face in the lamplight, noting the careful way he held himself, as if afraid to presume too much. This man, her husband now in the eyes of the law and the community, was offering her something precious, the gift of time, of choice, of autonomy over her own body and heart. "And if I am ready now?" she asked softly. Matthew's breath caught audibly. "Are you certain, Clara? There's no rush, no obligation. I meant what I said about expecting nothing you're not ready to give." "I know," Clara replied, taking a step toward him. "That's why I'm ready. Because you've given me the freedom to choose. Because you've treated me with respect from the first moment we met. I want to be your wife, Matthew, in every sense of the word." The tenderness with which he took her hand, the gentleness with which he led her to their bedroom, confirmed for Clara that she had made the right choice. This was not the passionate romance of her girlish dreams, but something deeper and more enduring, a partnership founded on mutual need that had blossomed, in the space of mere days, into genuine affection and trust. In the weeks that followed, that affection deepened into something Clara hesitated to name, though it warmed her heart and lightened her steps despite the increasing discomfort of her advancing pregnancy. Matthew was an attentive husband, a patient father to Jacob, and increasingly protective of Clara as her time drew near. He insisted on hiring a young woman from town to help with the heavier household chores, overrode Clara's protests that she was perfectly capable of continuing her duties, and even began sleeping in the chair beside their bed as her due date approached, afraid she might need him in the night. "You're being ridiculous," Clara told him one evening as he tucked extra blankets around her, despite the warmth of the fire. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, most of them without half the fuss you're making." Matthew's expression remained stubbornly concerned. "Rachel died in childbirth," he said quietly. "I won't risk losing you the same way." The admission silenced Clara's objections. She had known, of course, that his first wife had died, but not the specific circumstances. The fear in his eyes as he spoke of it, the protective way his hand rested on her belly, told her more about his feelings than any declaration of love could have done. "You won't lose me," she promised, covering his hand with her own. "I'm stronger." Then I look, and Dr. Wilson says everything is progressing normally. This baby and I are going to be just fine. The baby, as if in agreement, delivered a particularly vigorous kick that made them both laugh, breaking the tension of the moment. Labor began on a snowy December morning, the pain waking Clara from a restless sleep. She lay quietly for a moment, cataloging the sensations, recognizing them from descriptions she had heard but never experienced. The contractions were still far apart, she noted with clinical detachment. There was time yet to prepare. She rose carefully, not wanting to wake Matthew, who had finally been persuaded to return to their bed the night before. Moving quietly about the room, she gathered the items Dr. Wilson had advised her to have ready: clean linens, Hot water, the special herbs Mrs. Callahan had brought to strengthen her for the ordeal ahead. It was only when a particularly strong contraction caught her off guard, forcing a small gasp from her lips, that Matthew stirred. "Clara?" He was instantly alert, sitting up in bed, his eyes finding her in the pre-dawn gloom. "Is it time?" She nodded, unable to speak until the pain subsided. "I think so. But there's no need to rush. First babies take their time, or so Mrs. Miller tells me." Matthew was already pulling on his clothes, his movements swift and decisive. "I'm sending Jacob to the Callahans. First babies take their time, or so Mrs. Miller tells me." Matthew was already pulling on his clothes, his movements swift and decisive. "I'm sending Jacob to the Callahans, then writing for Dr. Wilson. I want you back in bed until I return." Clara might have argued under different circumstances, but another contraction seized her, stronger than the last, and she was grateful for Matthew's arm supporting her back to the bed. He helped her change into a clean nightgown, tucked the blankets around her with tender care, and pressed a kiss to her forehead before hurrying to wake Jacob and prepare him for the day ahead. The hours that followed blurred into a haze of pain and determination as Clara's body performed the ancient work of bringing new life into the world. Dr. Wilson arrived promptly, his calm presence a reassurance as the contractions intensified. Mrs. Callahan came too, bustling about with practical efficiency, heating water, preparing broth to keep Clara's strength up, offering encouragement in her no-nonsense way. Matthew, to Clara's surprise, refused to be banished to the parlor as was customary for expectant fathers. "I'm staying," he informed Dr. Wilson flatly, "unless Clara herself asks me to leave." Clara, in the grip of another contraction, managed to shake her head. "Stay," she gasped when the pain eased. "Please." And so he remained, holding her hand through each wave of agony, wiping her brow with cool cloths, murmuring words of encouragement and praise that she barely comprehended, but drew strength from nonetheless. When the final overwhelming urge to push came upon her, it was Matthew's steady voice that anchored her, his strong hands that supported her as she bore down with all her might. "I can see the head," Dr. Wilson announced. "One more push, Mrs. Harper. Your baby is almost here." Clara summoned her last reserves of strength for a final, tremendous effort and was rewarded with the indescribable sensation of the child slipping from her body, followed immediately by a thin, reedy cry that was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. "A girl," Dr. Wilson announced, lifting the squalling infant for Clara to see. "A perfect little girl." Clara reached for her daughter with trembling arms, overwhelmed by a surge of love so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. The baby was red-faced and wrinkled, covered in the remnants of birth. Yet to Clara she was the most exquisite creature ever created. "She's beautiful," Matthew said, his voice thick with emotion as he gazed down at the infant. "Just like her." "Mother." Clara looked up at him, startled by the naked adoration in his expression. This was not the face of a man fulfilling a practical arrangement, but of a father beholding his child for the first time, with wonder, with joy, with fierce, protective love. "Would you like to hold her?" Clara asked softly. Matthew hesitated, his hands so capable with horses and tools, suddenly seeming too large, too rough for such a delicate task. But when Clara placed the swaddled infant in his arms, he cradled her with instinctive tenderness, his eyes never leaving the tiny face. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "Welcome to the world. Welcome to our family." In that moment, watching her husband cradle her newborn daughter with such gentle reverence, Clara felt the final pieces of her heart click into place. This was her family now, not by blood, not by romantic passion, but by choice, by commitment, by the daily acts of love and care that bound them together more surely than any legal document or ceremony ever could. "What shall we name her?" Matthew asked, returning the baby to Clara's arms. Clara studied her daughter's face, noting the wisps of dark hair, the perfectly formed features, the tiny hands curled into fists as if ready to take on the world. A name came to her, one that seemed to encompass all they had found together, all they hoped to build. "Grace," she said softly. "Her name is Grace." Matthew nodded, his smile illuminating his entire face. "Grace Harper. It's perfect." As he leaned down to place a tender kiss on first the baby's forehead, then Clara's lips, she knew with bone-deep certainty that she had found her true home at last, not in a place, but in the hearts of this man and his son, and now in the daughter they would raise together as their own. "The child is mine now," Matthew whispered, echoing the promise he had made from the beginning. "Our child, our family, forever." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.